Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Isobel Roele.
Prof. Thank you very much for being with us. It's exciting to be chatting to you. Like all people in the UK at the moment, you have a big glass of water next to you.
I do. Yeah, it's super hot here. We're really having probably quite a sort of climate meltdown induced heat wave that's showing no sign of abating whatsoever.
Right, right. And maybe that's going to be the answer, or one of the answers to my question as to what's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you. What's going on for the prof?
What's going on? Gosh, um, I suppose what's not going on, we're having a climate meltdown and all sorts of other meltdowns. Um, I suppose partly because I'm here as a university academic, one of the things that's really preoccupying me is what's happening to UK higher education at the moment, where listeners might know lots of arts programs and cultural studies programs and humanities programs are being shut down in UK universities at the moment in the name of cost savings. And so I'm located in a law school, which is good because in some ways we're so-called safe. We've still got lots of students, but of course, the loss of the humanities in the universities is a loss for all of us. And so that's really something that I've been worrying about and thinking about with my colleagues, both in law and beyond.
And let me guess, the people making these decisions are paid vastly more than anybody teaching in the humanities and do not themselves teach or research anything.
Absolutely, yeah. So massive amounts of money being spent on consultations with incredibly expensive um, providers who are not academics. I mean, the universities, it's amazing. It's not just happening in my institution, but the university is paying money to experts when it actually has an entire university of experts that it already pays. Um, anyway, go figure, as the Americans say.
It is a great expression.
It is.
Really great expression. It's one that I understood instantaneously when I moved there, but one that took me more time was cut me some slack.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a pretty good one.
I
What?
didn't really get it at first. And then I thought, I guess this is about habiliments. This is a tailor. This is instructions about trouser size. Then, for example, metaphorized in some way,
Yeah,
or
nice.
slack in, at least in the sense of twine, knitting, who knows, right? In any event, yes, this is a difficult time. And of course, the interesting thing about where you're located, Prof, is that, as you say, the law appears to be a pragmatic and even a very safe option for students and parents and so on in terms of supposedly guaranteed careers and money. Although now that the British Supreme Court has been worried about briefs that are being prepared by artificial intelligence with vast numbers of errors in them, who knows? But that's its alibi. That's its justification. That's its, raison d'etre, apparently. But there have always been very keen ties to the humanities.
Yeah,
The
absolutely.
law and
So,
literature movement, the new approaches to international law movement at Harvard, critical legal studies, people, the critters, and so on. And you incarnate, you embody some of that, Prof, don't you?
well, I aspire to. I hope, I hope I do a bit. Yeah. So, in law, we have. It's quite funny because there's a sort of a perception amongst I guess, the public at large and amongst students that law degrees are a particular thing, maybe quite vocational. And I'm also conscious that I'm saying this in London, where a law degree is actually an undergraduate degree, but I think perhaps lots of your listeners, it's a bit different. So law degrees very often are postgraduate degrees and very much are routes into the profession. Um, and for me, I am really privileged to be able to teach in a way that takes law as a kind of analytical object rather than a sort of training site. Um, and so with lots of colleagues and building on decades now of people working, as you say, on law and literature and in the socio-legal studies movement and in critical legal studies, I have been thinking about law and the arts. And I think about that in the context of international law. I've been working on the United Nations since the year dot. United Nations has, when I first learned international law, was really where it was at still in the early 2000s. Um, and we thought in some ways then about international law as being almost synonymous with the UN, or the UN being like the main site of international law. And times have changed a bit, as listeners will probably know. Um, but I've been trying to think about the UN in different ways. And I found that thinking through artworks has been a really useful way of doing that because it's helped me decenter experts, international lawyers in particular, and diplomats and professional lawyers working in the UN, and helped me think about other groups. So particularly, for want of a better phrase, ordinary people.
I'm very happy that a very stupid, ignorant right-winger is no longer your prime minister. But his great claim to fame was allegedly his expertise in human rights and international law. Ho, ho, ho. I went to his hustings prof in 2015 in response to a question. Hustings means electoral campaign stop, often featuring in Britain all the candidates for a constituency, in which a question from the floor was, how do you think we can deal with China and the United States extremes of carbon emissions and effect on the planet? And he said, oh, international law can fix that. And I thought, I think you're stupid and or lying. Now I know he was both. You say that in the 2000s, there was great hope, great prospect for international law. But as far as I can see, the United States and its lapdogs, like Britain, basically, as soon as they lost their working majority in the UN by the early 60s, with the Russian independence from European colonialism, basically just did what they liked and didn't really care. But is just a nasty, angry, childish response on my part, or is there any element of truth in it? And tell me about moments of hope. I want to hear about the moments of hope, Prof.
Moments of hope. Okay. Gosh, there's so much I can say in response to what you've just said. One thing is your analysis is eternal, Toby. So this is something that has been going on. We hear it now. We were hearing it in the early 2000s. And in the early 2000s, just to kind of remind listeners, this is when we get sort of the war on terror really sort of bubbling up. And I guess they might think perhaps of these different ways that international law is being juxtaposed with something else. So at the moment, international law, the United Nations is being juxtaposed with the Board of Peace and with, interventions in Iran and interventions in Ukraine and interventions, what's happening in Gaza at the moment. And international law in that comparison, and as I said, this has been going on since 1945, and the UN in that comparison is always coming off in this really burnished way. So we end up having this kind of double think. And you see it in the press, but you also see it among international lawyers who should know better. International law is not an uncritical field. There's a sense in which, absolutely, we kind of drink the Kool-Aid, and we wouldn't be studying things like human rights unless we believed somewhere in it there was something. But we're also, as a discipline, as a field, very well aware that they often do more harm than good. So sometimes they're a fig leaf for other kinds of power operations. They hide them. Sometimes they're the vehicle for those power operations themselves. So one of the things that I worked on, about 10 years ago now, was the counterterrorism work that went on in the UN. as the counterpoint to the war on terror. This was supposed to be the nice, fluffy, effective, non-violent alternative. And it was meant to be pursued through law and legal rules. And so human rights would be respected and constitutional structures would be respected and all of that. And of course, it was a different flavor of the same problem. In fact, as you say, Toby, it's not that powers like the US don't use international law. It's that they also use international law to pursue their interests as well as everything else. And it can be really hard to disentangle the two. So you end up with this, as I said, this kind of doublethink, where on the one hand, you're desperate to keep hold of what's good and hopeful. That's a really good word. What's hopeful in things like human rights and adjudication and these kind of public fora of deliberation and transparency. But on the other hand, you know that 80 years of experience, in fact, more than 80 years, if we go before the United Nations, have shown that none of those things are guaranteeing any vulnerable people's interests, are never helping the people who are oppressed, are always, in fact, helping the people who are on top already. So cynicism is hard to avoid. And I think in my work prior to about 5 years ago, I found it very hard to be anything other than cynical and to write in a mode of unveiling and sort of demystification, I suppose, in the typical kind of critical legal tradition. But then I suppose, you get to a certain age.
Hope struck you.
Hope struck me.
Bolt of lightning.
Yeah. Middle age dawned, and I thought,
Middle age dawned. It was time to either buy a sports car and wear risque clothing or develop hope, or any of the above.
Exactly. So yeah, so I started putting away the sort of bureaucratic violence, which is what I'd been working on before, put it to one side for a while and started looking at the United Nations in the public eye. So rather than looking at what the United Nations actually achieves or actually could achieve, I was started to become interested in how it was imagined. So how did it operate as a kind of beacon of hope? And I was particularly interested in the formative years, so sort of 1945 until about 1965, that kind of first couple of decades. As I indicated before, cynicism was very much everywhere. So this is not a period when the public were totally sold on the UN. If you think about the mid-50s and then into the 60s, the Cuban Missile Crisis coming on the heels of Suez on Hungary, and this is not a happy kind of young institution which is not being judged. It's an institution in real difficulties. And financial difficulties too. The 1960s in particular, states were really withholding their dues, particularly the US, inevitably, which was the biggest kind of subscriber. They were giving the most money, and the UN was struggling to operate. And it really looked for a while in the 1960s like the whole thing would shut down. So that kind of sad, frightening story was subsisting at the same time as a kind of less well-known, I guess, story about the UN's immense presence in public culture. So millions of people, I forget the figures, I haven't got them in front of me, but something like 10 million people had visited the new Manhattan headquarters that were completed in 1952. By 1962. So in 10 years, there were 1 million people were coming a year. Really astonishing figures. And yeah, many of those were North Americans, more proximate. But not only, there was massive interest. People were going away with guidebooks and sending postcards. Lots of people will know, I guess, some of your listeners maybe even have made a headquarters tour themselves. And the tour hasn't changed very much. It was it's quite similar to the one that was being given in the 50s. And visitors now and visitors then could buy a postcard in the gift shop. The gift shop has existed always, inevitably. And then they could post it in the UN postbox and realized that they were not using a US stamp. They were using a special UN stamp because the UN is international territory. And so it was a kind of a sort of material culture way of making that point and making people part of this kind of quite extraordinary thing, actually, that you get in the middle of of New York. You get this little patch of land, which was international territory. And people were very charmed and excited by that. And in the 50s and 60s, lots of articles were coming out about whether, like, what would happen if somebody was murdered in the United Nations? Who would investigate? Would it be like a sanctuary? Could murderers escape there and hide? And of course, in the early 50s, that was absolutely shot through with fear about communism. So people totally thought the UN was a den of spies, a literal den of spies. Um, and then, and Glenda Sluga, the historian, has written about this. Hitchcock really played on this in the film North by Northwest. Yeah, you're nodding. So you remember that amazing shot from the top of the Secretariat building. Secretariat Tower is 48 stories high, and there's this shot purportedly from the top of the building. We see down this kind of vertiginous. And Hitchcock had asked Doug Hammarskjöld, who was the Secretary General at the time, if he could film in the actual UN premises. And he said no. And he said no, and as Glenda Sluga explains in her article, because of the reputation of the institution. So everything we see of the UN in North by Northwest is actually a stage set.
There's a faux shooting in the cafeteria, isn't there? Is that in the cafeteria of the UN?
It's not in that. So apparently he managed to smuggle a camera in, which is quite impressive because cameras were hard, like they were quite big objects back then. They were quite hard to smuggle. So apparently there are some shots that may be actual, but yeah, most of it was a set. In fact, he recreated it. So there was this massive sort of interest around the UN, and it was intrigue. It was intrigue about this kind of slightly overblown, ooh, international territory, ooh, the red threat. This kind of, and there was a sense of kind of glossy cosmopolitanism. The design of the United Nations headquarters in New York was really disparagingly called something like airport internationalism or something by an I forget which architectural historian it was that made the comparison. But there's an amazing book by an architectural historian called Olga Tulumi, which came out a couple of years ago, where she talks about the making of the UN headquarters campus in New York, which I thoroughly recommend. But it's for the listeners who've been there, it's super kind of its time. It's high modernist, international style. Le Corbusier was actually involved in designing it, and it was already dated really by the time it was finished in 1952, which is kind of the story of the UN's life. So any international relations scholars or international lawyers listening to this will be like, yeah, that happened to the charter too. As soon as it was completed, it was already out of date. Times had changed. But that aesthetic really fed into a sort of, it was almost like people were going and taking an aeroplane, which was a very glamorous thing to do at the time in the 1950s. And
My parents used to put me in a suit and tie at the age of.
So the UN has some amazing research resources. It has an absolutely fabulous photo archive library. And it's got archive. So in the 1950s, it had a team of photographers who were taking photographs. It had a photo unit. And so the photo archive is amazing. And it is full, in particular, the camera loved children. So it is full of scrubbed and primped and prepped little children in their Sunday best, very quietly smiling for the camera and lining up to see this organization. I can't imagine that they got they got very much out of the tour, but perhaps it was better than being in the classroom.
And Prof, one of the things you've written about in one of your essays is the artwork that adorns the Security Council.
Mm.
And you've used this, as it, I suppose, was intended to be, as a metaphor to talk about the big kids versus the little kids in the Security Council.
Oh yes, yeah. So, gosh, yeah, that article was quite a while ago now. Yeah. So that was thinking about the Security Council's kind of permanent members and non-permanent members, and this massive differential. I mean, this is, listeners will know one of the things about the United Nations is that it has this kind of idealized sense that all states are equal. But then we start thinking, well, there's already a problem there because who gets to be a state in the first place? I mean, yeah, us, the Palestinians, that one. Um, so we have these really big problems. And then even beyond that, when we are dealing with nation states, um, some of them have more rights than others. So in the Security Council, the five permanent members, so the USA, Russia, China, France, and the UK. And this is, I was saying it was immediately out of date. Well, France and the UK kind of really underscores that being involved in this kind of group of so-called great powers. And the thinking was that they were going to be the literal big guns that would enforce the charter system. But of course, they abused the power immediately it was given to them. And, so much for the sort of Rooseveltian idea of the policeman. And listeners can take that as cynically as they like, I think.
Prof, when I sat the exam to become a US citizen, there were 100 questions. Any 10 could be selected on the day for your exam, and you had to get at least 6 right. One of the questions was, which countries won the Second World War? And you'll be astonished to learn that somewhere called the Soviet Union was not a correct answer.
Okay.
So 25 million people and counting died in the war against fascism, but they didn't count. The correct answers were, Prof, USA, 1, 2, somewhere called France, which last I looked was sending Jews and others off in railway trains to be slaughtered, enslaved and slaughtered. And third, somewhere called England. So there were no Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish. These were the correct answers. Similarly, the correct answer to the question, what was Dwight D. Eisenhower's job before he became president of the United States? The correct answer should have been president of Columbia University, but of course it wasn't. It was Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in Europe during the war. So when I was studying for this, and I complained about this to my immigration attorney, he said, Toby, shut up. Do you become a citizen or don't you?
I guess it's really interesting that though, isn't it? Because perhaps that's the real test of belonging. Not that you know the correct answers, but that you make the same mistakes as everybody else. Perhaps that's...
Well, I don't think they're mistakes. Yes, that's
right.
I mean, apart from the one about England, but as you know, in the Americas, England means Britain. There's no distinction for people here.
Yeah.
Now, can I jump you ahead of 45 to 65 to what were my moments of hope? Just what you think about those. My moments of hope are third worldist. So the new international economic order that UNCTAD and others looked at in the 70s, and the new world information and communication or cultural order that UNESCO looked at in the 70s. Now, these were stomped on by you know who, but they were moments of immense hope for people in what we now call the global south. Is that fair to say, or were these just more pipe dreams?
Yeah, no, I think third world attempts to make something of these very problematic structures are I don't want to say always because generalizations always bite you in the bottom, but are the most hopeful moments in the UN's history. So, obviously Bandung before then. You're traveling slightly out of my favorite period, but yeah.
Well, in that case,
Absolutely.
be a politician. Answer the question you wished you'd been asked. Talk about Bandung and the non-aligned movement, because
Well, I guess,
that's
yeah.
in many ways that is the necessary precondition for these new orders that I was ranting on about.
Well, I think what's so interesting about them is that they're projects that try to come to terms with what we were talking about before, with seeing very, very clearly the problems with trying to use international law, with trying to use the UN's kind of really compromised and unequal structures to do something. So they see that in a very, very clear-eyed way. And nevertheless try and kind of um, use those to do something else. And I think that's the hopeful thing that everybody can learn from, I think. And there's so much amazing work in my field among third world international legal scholars. It's often called TWAIL. So if I say TWAIL, then that's what I mean. It's third world approaches to international law. And there are amazing scholars working in the field and who have been for years. Um, but the scholarship that they produce really shows the level of nuance and sort of as it has to be almost like a constant struggle with the hope and despair at the same time. Not to run away with a project in a way that ends up um, reproducing the problems that it seeks to solve. So one of the issues always for third world approaches in the UN and beyond the UN has been that the West European nations take it up as a legitimating device. So it gets taken away from third world states who've actually made the initiative, and it becomes a no, we are global, we are international, we're a universal, we're, et cetera, et cetera. So it ends up becoming a legitimating device. And the amazing thing about TWAIL scholarship is the persistence and the dedication to keeping the problematic nature of it on the surface of the project building, I guess. Um, and TWAIL scholars, so I'm particularly thinking of people like B.S. Chimney and Anthony Angie, have wrote really searchingly about the history within third world approaches of international law as well, about how much third world, as a third world international law, you're going to invest in this and how much you need to sort of divest yourself from the system. And there's been a constant kind of struggle within that literature. Yeah, a constant back and forth. And of course, we're still having the back and forth now. So, at present, when we have the Board of Peace initiative, the kind of the reaction, the immediate reaction for a lot of international lawyers is to start valorizing the United Nations system because, you know, yeah, and third world approaches to international law, in particular, understandably, are very, very interested in what's going on in Gaza at the moment, are constantly reminding us to beware of doing that, to beware of kind of airbrushing out 80 years of history from the UN because it seems like a less bad option. So yeah, very much finding ways of kind of going in with your eyes open, going into hope, I guess, with your eyes open.
One of the things you've written about is the word rogue
Mm.
and the notion of a rogue state. I always thought there was sort of two rogue states when I was growing up, the USSR and the United States. What's a rogue state? And you use Derrida's work to help explain this. And why is it inevitable that there be rogue states?
Oh yeah, well, I wrote that years ago now. But I've been lately, I was reading Naomi Klein's Doppelganger. Have you read that one? It's so interesting. It's where she talks about being mistaken for Naomi Wolf all the time, and she uses that to sort of extrapolate this amazing account of like this sort of shadow world. And that book really speaks to my research, I think. Um, and rogue states perform that shadow function. And this is why there is always going to be, I wrote it, when I wrote it, I was thinking about it because it was many years ago. I was thinking about the axis of evil. I don't know if you, your listeners will remember. Do you remember, Toby, the axis of evil during the War on Terror, which was, I think, Iraq and Iran, and was it Syria as well? Or North Korea? I forget now. Anyway, there was an axis of evil and these bad states, and of course, the shadow world enables the securitizing policies and the way that you can constantly say, well, it would be lovely to have the bright and sunny uplands, and we'll get there one day. But before we get there, we first have to kind of crack down on bad elements, on the sort of dangerous elements. Um, and they're always a reason, and there are always going to be these kind of rogue states or rogue elements. The rogue states were replaced by terrorists, these quote unquote shadowy networks. Um, and I wanted one of the things I wanted to do later was to try and think a little bit about how I sort of wanted to turn that equation on its head. So I wanted to think a little bit about how certain forms of international law, which were supposedly effective ways of doing counterterrorism, for example, without doing harm, were nevertheless best seen as a kind of uncanny or shadow version of an international law of human rights and human freedom, a sort of emancipatory international law. We have this idea that international law, is the rule of law, and it is playing by the rules. It's following the rules, not man-made power, not sort of the power of individuals, not. And we have the idea that respecting international law means respecting human rights and respecting the sovereign equality of other states and respecting the resources in different parts of the world and respecting the environment. This kind of but international law also means, as every international lawyer listening to this, if there are any, knows, that it also means supporting kind of commercial systems and trade. And international law is just as much those kinds of rules which go into subjecting states to constant performance reviews about their over their development assistance, for example, where they say, the donor nations are on top and get to say, you need to do X, Y, and Z, or you won't get your tranche of money or the technical assistance that you hope for. So what I wanted to do was to show how international law was part of that shadow world rather than being a kind of alternative to it. But yeah, I wish I'd read Naomi Klein's books before, because I think the doppelganger thing is much better than the uncanny law thing that I actually came up with.
A friend of mine was one of Naomi Wolf's roommates in college, but
Oh,
I'll tell you
really?
about that when we're not recording. Can I ask you to give us the scoop about your book, Articulating Security, the United Nations and its Infra Law? I say this because I've not read it. Working in the global south, there just aren't budgets to buy books in English. And it's this cretinous preference for journals, So would you mind telling us about this book? And I asked you about it now because you mentioned securitization, and I'm assuming that's a pretty important part of the volume.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I guess it's about collective security, really. And the book is doing, in fact, I've already been talking a little bit about it without naming it. But the book is about the UN's counterterrorism strategy, the global counterterrorism strategy that it launched in 2006, but had kind of pre-launched in 2001 after the attacks on the World Trade Center, when the Security Council passed Resolution 1373. I don't know if any listeners will remember that. It's sort of, yeah, 25 years ago now. There've actually been in my field lots of sort of anniversaries of this resolution, as though it's a kind of thing to celebrate. Because partly in 2001, as well as Resolution 1373, which was a very bureaucratic resolution, which seemed super sensible, very international law-y. It said states are going to have all these responsibilities now to prevent the funding of terrorist groups, to prevent circulation of terrorist people around the world, to criminalize terrorism and so on. So it looked like the sensible option compared to an earlier resolution, is it 1368? It's a while ago now. Resolution 1368, which was the one that invited the United States, or reminded the United States, that it had a right to self-defense against actions like the one that it had taken. So it was sort of the carte blanche for the war on terror and all of the violence, the military violence that happened afterwards. And I'm kind of, I suppose, laboring the point of these two resolutions because they offered two different faces of counterterrorism response. And they were both really part of the global war on terror, which, was a US, I guess, invention that Britain and that many other countries very quickly got on board with. And they were the sort of two faces of this, but they were going to be a really robust kind of face. And they were both Security Council initiatives. And, listeners will remember the United States had an enormously immense importance in the Security Council. In fact, they were often seen as the kind of primus inter pares of the permanent members, the most important permanent member. And so the United Nations, as time went on, started to panic a bit, and Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General at the time, realized that this was looking like, a very, what was called at the time unilateralism, a very sort of unilateralist use of the United Nations for, to sort of valorize and legitimate what was going on in the US and sort of Western Europe as well. And so what they did was to create a genuinely, I'm doing inverted commas, rabbit ears, a genuinely international universal counterterrorism strategy, because their idea was, hold on a minute, terrorism is a problem for all of us. And the UN came up with this idea of a threat without boundary. And so the book really drills down into this idea of threats without boundaries, where the central idea is that a threat to one is a threat to all. And listeners who are a bit more long in the tooth will really remember this, but it's a discourse that's disappeared a bit now. But there was this kind of, you have a unilateralist, bad United States, Britain, Spain, other countries doing this bad stuff. And we can be multilateralist instead. And that's the sort of sensible, good option. And multilateralism ought to be through this universal United Nations. So threats without boundaries were unbounded in the sense that, a threat like climate change or terrorism or transnational organized crime or the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And there are more. It's quite a long list of things affect everyone. The United Nations also pointed out that these are threats which sort of bleed into one another. So they're also threats without boundaries in the sense that transnational organized crime, money laundering and so on, funds terrorist activities. Terrorist activities are, find a home in countries which are in a difficult kind of economic position because of, various other things. So these things were all interlinked. The interconnection of the threats was another kind of axis of connection. And then threats are also without boundaries, the UN pointed out, in the sense that they are not isolated events. they can't be dealt with by a single one-off strike. And you can see, can't you, why they see this as like a really good response to the war on terror, because they're saying, war on terror is all about these surgical strikes and the assassination of key figures and the intervention into particular states, into Afghanistan, into Iraq. And the UN was trying to point out, well, hold on a minute, everything is a bit more connected than that, and you can't fix these boundless problems with these kind of bounded violent responses. The problem, of course, if you have this boundless threat, if you construct a threat that has no boundaries, your response is going to have no boundaries either. And that was the really big problem. So, if the threat has no boundaries, well, are we going to have infinite war forever? And the UN said, no, we're not, because we're not going to have a violent response. We're going to have a response which is a managing response. And, the UN is first and foremost, and this is one of the reasons, by the way, just to allude to what we were talking about before, why it's so hard to take the UN as a site of hope, because whatever else it is, fundamentally, it's a bureaucracy. It's an organ of managerial governance, and it's sort of an organization, an agent of managerial governance, platform of it. So the way the UN works, it doesn't have its own army, it doesn't have its own police force, it doesn't have any of that, it has to rely on its member states. But what it does have is absolutely loads of bureaucrats and auditors and all of that kind of stuff. And of course, it has technical assistance programs and so on, through which those individuals work. And so what it did instead was to produce a response which would be productive. So instead of being, sorry, there's car noise in the background. I'm in central London, so inevitable, I suppose. Instead of meeting threats with violence, what it would try and do would be to alleviate or to produce the conditions which would prevent the threats taking hold. Sounds very sensible. But of course, if you do that, you start, and this is, I guess, where a version of the rogue state comes back in. Not the rogue state so much as the weak state. Because what you end up with is a sort of situation where you look at the world and you say, well, we've got these good developed states, and the developed states have good criminal justice systems and big prisons and, banks with, which are not meant to be corrupt and all of that kind of stuff. And then they look at the developing world and they see high scores on corruption indexes. They see no proper criminal justice system. They see judges without the right training. They see holes in the kind of banking system. They see all of these problems. And so in order to make states equally capable of dealing with these threats without boundaries, the United Nations makes it a development problem. And what that ends up doing is to sort of figure third world states, as they used to be known, developing states, less developed states, as they're known kind of now, as the problem. And there's an awful lot of discourse, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, about sort of self-ownership and about these nations being very much on board with the idea that they're going to become effective sort of counterers of terrorism or counterers of money laundering and all of that kind of stuff. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, that sounds really familiar. It really sounds to me like what Foucault is describing in Discipline and Punish. It sounds like the difference between the kind of war repressive power and the productive power of these kind of well-trained factory workers or well-trained infantry brigades, or and obviously you have to be careful. This is a different context. It's not the same thing at all. But I started to think that with a little bit of careful kind of transposition. There's a really nice article in Critical Inquiry by Colin Koopman and Thomas Matzer about using Foucault's concepts like this. And it was super helpful. But with a little bit of kind of wiggling, for want of a more technical word, you can kind of see how a different form of domination is being produced through these supposedly safe, soft power measures that the UN was taking. So that was the idea of the articulated security, that it was this totally joined up, boundless response to these boundless threats. And what the book does, having described that, is then to think about how international law scholars were looking at what was going on. And there were some international law scholars were looking at it and thinking, yeah, this is fantastic. Finally, the United Nations is coming into its own. International law is vindicated. You know, finally, we've got the United Nations taking this seriously. There are, you know, all these treaties and Security Council resolutions and so on being agreed. They're being given binding force in international law, and that's all great. And some of them started using the language of what's sometimes called in international relations the domestic analogy. Any IR scholars listening to this will recognize that, where they would describe a Security Council resolution, for example, as a quasi-legislative action. Or they would describe like a sort of an ombudsman terrorist sanctions process as a quasi-adjudicative process. And you know, they're really not. The ombudsman process is not the same as a kind of, when we think about sort of courtroom adjudications, if we're thinking about, you know, this idea of fair play and so on, and reasoned sort of reasoned discussion. Similarly, the Security Council is not a legislature. Some books were written in the early 2000s which start describing the Security Council as a sort of legislature. And as soon as you start using that language, this idea of the Security Council is a parliament, what? Or it could be compared to a parliament. You can see how that is starting to legitimate these things as almost kind of constitutionally freighted, you know, that these are parts of sort of a constitutional or a sort of juridico-political order that we might recognize from, you know, our own governments, our own sort of nations. Not all international lawyers did that. So other international lawyers, and as I've indicated already, there's hugely strong critical tradition in international law. Critical international lawyers, and I very much include myself in this group, went the other direction and went, this is absolutely terrible. This is nothing like international law. And there was a very famous article that came out in like 2010 or maybe a bit before that, by one of the leading scholars in the critical international law tradition, Martikos Kanyemi, where he distinguishes what he calls a managerial mindset from the constitutional mindset. And in the process of bringing out all of the problems with these sorts of managerial techniques that looked a bit like law but weren't really like law, you know, all of this performance review and ombudsperson process and so on and so forth, Security Council resolution making. In the process of doing that, what ended up happening is that some critical lawyers ended up sort of valorizing the old form, the idealized form of international law as almost this quasi sort of constitutional system. This sort of emancipatory potential came back up to the surface. And so I wanted to find a way to do what Twale scholars, I guess, as I was talking about before, had been doing for a long time, which was to try and look at it with clear eyes without either grabbing it as evidence that, yeah, international law is vindicated, woohoo, or completely spitting it out. I liked that vision of kind of spitting it out, because it reminded me of Julia Kristeva's work on abjection. And it made me think of psychoanalytic sort of analyses of absolute revulsion. And so I ended up thinking about the uncanny and the abject. And I was thinking about how, you know, if we think about international lawyers' very critical response to these kinds of techniques of managerial governance, we might take the sort of affect of that really seriously, this sort of visceral revulsion to it. A lot of the articles that came out were really sort of, ugh, this is, insupportable. Um, and we might take that seriously and think about what was happening in the sort of the spitting out of managerial governance from international law. And one of the things, of course, that Freud says about the uncanny is that it's not the recognition of the externally weird, but it's the return of the repressed. So it's an invitation to think about, what have we repressed about international law? That's the problem that we're not wanting to see now. And that's the book, really. It was thinking about that and thinking about the particular sorts of authority claims that international law makes. And it's really, I guess, germane to today. So when we're thinking about the temptation, when we look at what's happening in Gaza, we look at what's happening in Ukraine, and we look at the, Trump and the Board of Peace and all of that, it's so tempting to say, run to international law, uphold these institutions. This is what we've got. Let's keep them and uphold them. But I think it's quite important actually to stay with the problematic elements of that have been proven problematic for so many years. And that's what the sense of the uncanny, I guess, has tried to do, that looks at the sort of performative echoing, or the Naomi Klein word, this idea of the shadow world, and thinks about our visceral reaction against that as not just revealing something problematic with Trump, but reminding us that that element is already within the world that we're valorizing, and kind of the ideas that we're wanting to legitimate.
I note that the Board of Peace is a misspelling. It should, of course, be BORED. So,
oh, the joke.
I just thought I made it up. It's a bit sad. Prof, I wanted to ask you about the interplay of the rational and the irrational here. You've mentioned psychoanalysis as being of great value, and I know you've mentioned Kristeva, but also you've used Winnicott's work and others, and how that plays out against, for example, the preferences, so we say, of another writer whose work you use quite a lot, namely Habermas, who's not an enemy of psychoanalysis. He's just always fighting with his vision of Adorno, I suspect, and Marx, but who's wanting to see a triumph of reason in a Kantian sense. So, as my last question, I wanted to ask you about that sort of struggle between the idea of the inevitability of the irrational and the desirability of the rational. And once you've answered that, and your starter for 10, once you've answered that, Prof, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to add anything you wish. And that addition might take the form of going over terrain we've partially covered, where you want to say some more, or it might be a topic that we haven't discussed at all. So the first thing is this, my last query directly to you is the rational and the irrational, in a sense, even though I understand that binary is problematic.
Yeah. I suppose I worked on Habermas when I was doing my PhD, and I was really interested in the theory of communicative action, and I sort of fell into it almost by accident, and I think I exhausted my patience with Habermas during that process.
Sorry, I'm bringing back the repressed.
You are, yeah, return of the repressed. So, and I've written critically since about Habermas. It's interesting now, when he passed away, that there've been, this kind of moment to reappraise and think again, and especially to think again in the light of what's happened. And Habermas wrote a lot about the international sphere. He wrote about human rights. He was very, very interested in the International Criminal Court, these developments in the early 2000s. And I've written very critically about how he tried to make it all add up, and it just didn't add up. And I suppose the point that I got to with it is that this sort of arch rationalism ends up becoming itself incredibly irrational. And this will be news to none of your listeners, I think. The way the rational can slip into the irrational so easily. And I suppose that's been a bit of a theme of all of my work. So it's really a theme of the collective security work on counterterrorism. It's hyper managerialism is hyper rational. It's so rational. Um, and it's that rationality, that kind of relentless cost-based, improvement-based, progress-based rationality that makes it so irrational. Um, because it doesn't make process. Its costs are exorbitant. Its costs in kind of human beings and in, human lives and in the environment and in all of the things we might want to value, are, and there's an amazing a scholar called Andrew Lang and his collaborators as well, who have this brilliant phrase, and they call it global ungovernance. I really like that. And what they mean by global ungovernance is that none of this stuff works. It's just, this churn of rational, of these kind of rational processes and the kind of going over that same ground again and again ends up looking like, to use psychoanalytic language, it looks like these kind of defense formations that are kind of being put out again and again, this kind of compulsion to repeat as well, that's kind of going on. As well as getting into that security stuff, and security is always going to be a place where psychoanalysis is helpful as a way of thinking about it, and where the irrational very, very quickly appears on the surface. But as well as that, my more recent work, which has kind of looked at the arts, which I sort of mentioned and then stupidly didn't really say much about, has looked at works produced by the UN in its early years. And you see also in that a kind of play of rationalism and irrationalism. So I've been writing lately about a film that was made by the UN. In fact, it's the UN's first and last ever in-house feature film. So not including films made by UNESCO, but in terms of the UN organization proper, it was made in 1959 by the Department of Public Information. At that point under the direction of a British filmmaker called Thorold Dickinson. And Power Among Men is actually precisely about this play of the rational and the irrational. Because it's about, he really wanted to make a film. He was inspired by the goddess Kali and this idea of creation and destruction. And at once, in the same thing. And he wanted to make a film that would show the sort of the destructive seed in progressive wealth creation. And he looks at, the film, it's a kind of documentary, but it's a very storytelling documentary. And he tells stories about a company town in Kitimat in Canada, in British Columbia. He tells stories about a farming village called Fermate in Haiti, and about reconstruction efforts in a village near Monte Cassino in Italy. And in all of these stories, what comes out in the narrative is the kind of, they're on the surface, they're these kind of lovely progress narratives of reconstruction and agricultural development and, everybody living happily together. But what the stories try and do is to preserve this dangerous element, this kind of destructive element that can't be escaped from, that in fact is always going to escape. And we could figure that in the language of rationality and irrationality as well. The rationality of economic progress and the rationality of all of this holds within it this destructive, irrational seed. Because what the film ends up doing and what Dickinson really wanted and then ended up having to water it down. He was very upset because the film ended up being so tame, but he wanted to make an anti-nuclear weapon film. That's what Power Among Men was fundamentally meant to be, an anti-nuclear weapon film. And he tried. There are lots of mushroom explosions in the film, and lots of footage from the US Army that they took in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and all of that is designed to shock the audiences out of their complacency. Um, but he was so worried that the film was going to be censored by member states, as an earlier film he'd made had been censored, one that dealt with the Suez Crisis. Britain, France, and Israel had refused to allow it to be released. That every punch he tried to land, he ended up pulling. Suppose, yeah, what we end up then is a film. You can see it if you look at the UN's audiovisual library, which again is a fantastic resource. You can watch the film, um, and it fails to really retain the irrational. It ends up being a kind of a paean to the rationality of the UN. Yeah.
And finally, Prof, anything you'd like to add? As I said, that might, oh, she's almost finished her glass of water, so it really is time to stop.
It's actually really well timed. I really have.
I recorded the other day with another prof in Britain, and she had the glass of water, which she was applying to her cheeks as well and her
Oh,
neck, which was
yeah.
pretty good.
Well, if I'd had the foresight to put ice in my glass, then I definitely would be doing that.
Anything you'd like to add? As I said, it might take the form of something entirely new or retreading over things we've partially touched on.
Gosh, what an invitation. It's a lovely invitation. Um, I don't know. I suppose I sort of want to end a little bit where I came in, talking more broadly about taking the arts and the humanities seriously in higher education. And a lot of my work now is, is looking at film studies and cultural studies and literary studies. I'm collaborating with actually my partner, who's a musician and a classical music journalist, collaborating on a piece about Benjamin Britten, and encountering these amazing scholars and people working in the classical music industry, and singers and and artists and so on, and doing this project about the works that the UN has produced and commissioned and given a platform to has been really wonderful. And I suppose I wanted to end a little bit with this preoccupation of you don't know what you've got until it's gone. And I'm very, I look at what's happening in my institution and in the country in general, and I think more broadly, I think listeners elsewhere will recognize it, of English lit departments, art history departments, cultural studies departments being systematically closed down. And I think, what next for our young people, for the students? Yeah, it worries me.
A sad note, but a powerful one. Thank you so much for being with us today. I really have learned a lot from chatting to you.
Thank you so much for listening to me, and thank you for inviting me, Toby. It was an absolute pleasure.